So Gabrielle is part of an exhibition called The Normal. And this is something we have worked on during lockdown. So we have curated it in real time, and it is aiming to respond to many of the curly interlocked ideas that this pandemic has revealed to us, that we can step off the train of progress, that viruses are out there and they're coming ever closer to us through deforestation, through the marketization of wildlife, through the melting of the polar caps. So really thinking about the effect of this pandemic through the lens of sustainability and recognizing that the old normal wasn't. But also looking at the social effect and the cultural shift and the dynamic political cultural shift that's happened throughout this period as well. It's meant a lot to a lot of people in different ways, and we've tried to unlock that generally across the exhibition. It's on at Talbot Rice Gallery until the end of the festivals, as we say here in Edinburgh, which means until the end of August. So please do come and see it if you haven't already. To give you a bit of a background on Gabrielle Goliath, she's an artist who lives in Johannesburg, where she'll be speaking from tonight, thus in the future. And you can read about her exhibition history in a catalogue that you can actually download from our website for free. In 2019, she was awarded the prestigious Standard Bank Young Artist Award and also the special award of the Future Generation Art Prize. During the pandemic, we've all been locked down all over the world, and somehow Gabrielle has managed to also mount solo exhibitions in Konsthal in Stockholm, Gothenburg Konsthal in Gothenburg, the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris. So hopefully she'll share with us tonight what sort of magic and alchemy made that possible. We all felt that there was certainly some purple magic in the air as we prepared our installation with her over 2020. Seeing as you've made it here to the Zoom room tonight, you've probably read about her focus of the evening and are just as keen as I am to hear her talk about the scratch and the rhapsodic. But when Gabrielle spoke recently with Claire Armitstead in The Guardian, who'd spent a couple of days up in Edinburgh in our exhibition, she spoke of a history that demands an accounting of racial slavery, colonialism and apartheid, and the ways in which bodies continue even now to be differentially valued. And you can still read that really interesting feature on the Guardian website. But what Gabrielle is perhaps less likely to describe herself is the emotional intensity of her work. There's an aesthetic power to her work, an unshakable feeling that in the face of sometimes quite difficult and confronting subject matter, the subjects have been approached with grace. And the experience is deeply affecting. I'm left feeling that I'm in the presence of a great work of art made by a great artist. Thank you, Gabrielle, for being with us here virtually in Edinburgh this evening and being open to take questions at the end. And I'll now hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Tessa, and thank you, James, and thank you, Colm. I think, if anything, I would say that during this time that has been attended by so much difficulty and the conditions of engaging with one another via remote means, I wouldn't put it down to alchemy. I would put it down to the politics of care. And just to acknowledge before I enter into my conversation, well, my talk, that Tessa and James and Colm have shown such curatorial care. And for that, I'm grateful. And that's the kind of care that makes possible and holds a work like this song is for within the space. So thank you. So thank you to you all, and I shall begin now. James, if you could please go into the presentation. Thank you. A tribute to Eunice Ntombifuthi Dube by Thulisile Portia Dube. To my beloved daughter, Sister Shasha. They say death comes when it comes, and it is a necessary ending, and that death is not the end, but just another path that one has to take. But how is death necessary? How is it just another path that one has to take when it is determined by somebody else other than God? If we were not Christians, we would be asking, where was God when that monster decided to end your life? How does one come to terms with this? It was the morning of September 20th, 2017. At home, it wasn't just another day. It was our mother's birthday, and she was receiving birthday messages and lots of love from all who know her. She received so many calls on the day, and when she received another call, she took it with a smile, thinking it was another call from well wishers, as it was her birthday. That was the call that would spoil her day and possibly her birthday for the rest of her life. The news was that her beloved Shasha had been brutally murdered. She is widowed and without a son, so she was tasked with going to face the motionless and bloodied body of her beloved Shasha. What will September 20th be to us going forward? Our mother's birthday celebration, the morning of your death, celebration of your short-lived life. Only time will tell, as the wound is still very fresh on our minds and hearts. It wasn't just another day when news broke that you were no more. Never did we imagine that your life would end like that. Of course, we knew that someday you would depart this world, but not in a manner that you did or was done to you. Let alone through atrocious ways of a monster you called all sorts of sweet names. Love, baby. Little did you know that it would be the very same person that would end your life in the cruelest of ways. Somebody might ask, why are we calling your killer a monster? The very same man that you loved and shared your life with. We have the simplest of answers. Who beats someone they love to death using a hammer? Who suffocates someone they love while they are struggling to move and in excruciating pain? Only a monster would do that. You were a daughter, a sister, aunt, and a friend to so many people, and you will always be in our hearts, and we will continue celebrating your life. May your soul rest in perfect peace. Mthombofuthi Eunice Shasha Dube. Next slide, please, James. So this eulogistic text was shared with me by Thulisile on the occasion of an elegy performance staged in Johannesburg at the Center for the Less Good Idea in commemoration of her sister, Mthombofuthi Eunice Shasha Dube. This is a practice I undertake in all elegy performances in which I approach a family member or friend of the individual being commemorated, requesting a eulogistic text. These texts are made available at the performance and are significant in exercising what I see as a certain re-inscription of the individual, the particular Black feminine life, into a context of generalizing, dehumanizing, raced, gendered, and sexualized violence. In coming to the performance, we gather, and on turns grounded in acknowledged loss, often incommensurable difference, enact a certain work of commemoration around the absent presence of this named, loved, and now mourned individual. Next slide, please, James. This particular performance came about and was staged in an especially personal, close, and relational context. Pretty Nkosinathi, pictured here, is a beautiful vocalist, but also cousin to Mthombofuthi. Sometime before, we had collaborated on another elegy performance commemorating Karabo Mokoena, whose mutilated and burnt body was found dumped in a shallow grave in Lyndhurst, a suburb of Johannesburg, South Africa, on the 28th of April, 2017. The accused, Karabo's boyfriend at the time, Sandile Mansu, has subsequently been found guilty and sentenced to a cumulative 32 years in prison. Suffice to say, Pretty was undone by the experience of participating in the public and vulnerable labor of elegy. However, having shared with me the devastating circumstances surrounding the death of her cousin, we decided together to work at presenting an elegy performance for Mthombofuthi. Pretty spoke to family members and friends, and with their consent, we gathered with 6 other vocalists to enact the sonic vigil and collective work of mourning that is elegy. Next slide, please, James. Elegy is a long-term performance project I initiated in 2015 in response to the endemic violence of rape culture in South Africa. Ritualistic in form, each elegy performance calls together a group of seven women vocalists who collectively enact a work of mourning. Sustaining a single note over a course of an hour, they invoke the absent presence of a named woman or genderqueer person subjected to fatal acts of gendered and sexualized violence in South Africa. Significant to the work is how loss and a certain sustained irresolution, rather than closure, becomes a site for community and for empathic, cross-cultural, and cross-national encounters. For years now, I have engaged with the problematic of the representation of violence and have sought to find ways in which to work around, even refuse, the perpetuated violence through which Black, brown, feminine, and queer bodies are routinely objectified, and for all their hypervisibility, rendered indistinguishable. And it is in this context that I situate elegy as subject-centered, as specific, as collaborative, and as a work that I believe calls for close and intersubjective encounters in which we find ourselves involved, entangled, and yes, complicit in a terrifyingly ordinary normative paradigm of violence as structural, endemic, systemic, patriarchal, everyday. Next slide, please, James. Over the last 6 years, I presented elegy performances in multiple contexts, in South Africa, Brazil, the US, and Europe. Whilst many of these performances have been directed towards contemporary instances of gendered and sexualized violence, I felt it important to include amongst those commemorated 2 women enslaved at the Cape Colony, South Africa, in the early 19th century, Louisa van der Kaap and Cornelia van Pilawane, both of whom were killed by their intimate partners. Gathering around these historically marginalized figures is significant in that it speaks to the inextricable relation of rape culture today to the desubjectifying logics of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, and makes possible to some degree a kind of reparative, historical, and transgenerational work. Next slide, please, James. In 2019, I presented Elegy as a 7-channel video and sound installation, and since then, it has shown in different locations. In this configuration, 7 performances sound in unison, with open sound, resonating in relation. I'd like to play you an excerpt of the installation to give you some sense, at least, of this collective sounding. Needless to say, this is not the synesthetic experience of being held within the arc, the life-size screens, and the immersive sonic environment of the work as an installation. If we could play that video, please, James. I wanted to open this conversation with elegy and to take you through some of the forms it has taken, precisely because for me, it has been a way of calling about and sustaining through multiple iterations an alternative approach to memorialization, to commemoration, to a certain re-inscription of Black feminine life, and through what I understand as a collective political work of mourning. This is very much about thinking or rethinking representation through Black, brown, feminist, and queer lenses. And Gayatri Spivak's articulation of representation is helpful here, as an artistic and political project in which to represent can mean both to depict in aesthetic terms and to speak or decide for or on behalf of. For Spivak, this means that the normalized conditions of who can portray what and how becomes a marker of political authority. This demands a certain recognition of historical formations and present conditions of race and gender, and the ways in which these inform a subterranean grammar of representation that governs which bodies are available to violence and who can or cannot image, write, or speak about them. I find the work of A.O. Coley helpful in thinking through some of these knotty issues and how they relate to some of the ways in which I have sought to navigate a field of representation in which every gesture and tactic bears with it the potential to enact some form of symbolic perpetuation, traumatic recall, painful citation, and the affective drive of the image, sound, or action, some sort of wounding. Coley draws our attention to what she describes as a colonial hauntology of the Black African female body, through which any attempt to represent such a body is historically bound to the colonial conscription of the Black African female body as abject, deviant, hypersexual, and grotesque. In response to this normative pathologizing of Black femme bodies, the question for Coley is, what is available and even possible in the realm of representation to Black women artists working from the site of this haunting, that being the very bodies they inhabit? For me, elegy is one way of working around what I understand as an appropriative impulse of representation bound to the colonial inscription and conscription of Black femme bodies, and to the corresponding self-perpetuating violence of rape culture. I would like to now turn to another more recent body of work, The Song is Full. Next slide, please, James. This Song is Full is an immersive 22-channel video and sound installation I initiated in 2019, and which is currently installed and sounding within the Talbot Bryce Gallery, Edinburgh, and will soon be doing so within the Durban Art Gallery in South Africa. As with elegy, this is a work that has and continues to travel and show transnationally, which is very important to me on a personal and political level. Rather than speaking about the work, I would like to speak alongside, from, and within it, and ask that we reflect upon and collectively gather around two ideas that for me are really at the social and political heart of this work. And these are the scratch and the rhapsodic. Next slide, please, James. So we begin with Nondumiso Msimanga's song, Bohemian Rhapsody, shared with me as a dedication song to her own survival. The well-known anthem by Queen, later reimagined by the Braids, is here performed anew by Nonku Piri as one of 11 songs that collectively constitute the song cycle and video and sound installation that is This Song is For. And these are the words she offered to me to accompany her song and to hold the space in which it sounds. I tried to kill myself. I still want to kill myself. I have to fight to not want to kill myself. I don't want to just die. I am a fighter, and every day I am fighting for my life, fighting for it to matter. Here's to the good fight. Nondomiso's offering speaks to the proximate relation of rape to death. To the extent that rape is a physical violence, yes, but also an inscriptive and deeply political violence, historically informed and recycled in the present as a marking of certain bodies as disposable, as rapeable, killable, as matter that does not matter. Here, Vina Das speaks to the experience or non-experience of individuals physically alive but socially dead. This is a social and symbolic death of disavowal, pollution, foreclosure, ostracization, and lack, the utter negation of Black femme life. When thinking about and relating to the living death of rape, we must join with Das in asking, what happens then to the work of mourning? Next slide, please, James. Flo, another survivor and extraordinary person with whom I collaborated on this project, shared her song with me, Don't Wish Me Well by Solange, and these are her words which never fail to undo me. Death knocked on my door. He took away my innocence for sure. Death left me on the sewer floor with a soul no more. This death that is rape is, for Puma Dineo Hola, inseparable from the structural self-perpetuation of patriarchal power, reigning in, enforcing submission, and punishing defiance. This is patriarchy as constitutive of colonial modernity and its racialized, gendered, sexualized, economized, and nationalized hierarchization of human life. It is an everyday normative crisis of rape culture that clearly communicates which lives matter and perpetuates the disposability of those that do not, here in South Africa, but also transnationally. It is a paradigm of permissible violence in which Black femme life is marked, tracked, traced, and determined by conditions of death and a drive to negation. Such are the political conditions of inscription, of lived precarity, that make sense of and render urgent the Black feminist injunction to refuse. For to live is to live in spite of, in the refusal of this terminal demarcation. And so I circle back to Nondomiso and hear this refrain of refusal and claim in spite of all. I have to fight to not want to kill myself. I don't want to just die. I am a fighter, and every day I'm fighting for my life, fighting for it to matter. Here's to the good fight. And here I would like to introduce the idea, the experience, and the site of encounter that is the scratch. As mentioned, this song is for is a 22-channel video and sound installation. I think of it as a song cycle. It is an immersive experience of light, color, sound, and text. Next slide, please, James. In The Song is For, I return to and re-perform the popular convention of the dedication song in collaboration with a group of women and genderqueer-led musical ensembles. Playing sequentially within the immersive sonic space of the installation is a unique collection of dedication songs, each chosen by a survivor of rape and performed as a newly produced cover version. These are songs of personal significance to the survivors, songs that transport them back to a particular time and place, evoking a sensory world of memory and feeling. I've already spoken to Nondomiso Msimanga's song, as well as Flo's, and the text they shared, which is another critical component of the work, as each survivor shared with me their chosen song, as well as a color and a text, be it a poem, reflection, or narrative of their experience or healing journey. Introduced within each of the songs is a sonic disruption, a recurring musical rupture, recalling the broken record effect of a scratched vinyl LP. Presented in this performed disruption, and it is really crucial that it is performed, is an opportunity for listeners to affectively inhabit a contested space of traumatic recall, one in which the desubjectifying violence of rape and its psychic afterlives become painfully entangled with the personal and political claims to life, dignity, hope, faith, and even joy. And it is the space of the scratch that I would like for us to briefly inhabit and linger in. If you could play the video, please, James.
Mama, ooh, I don't wanna die. I sometimes wish I'd never been born at all. Carry on, as if nothing really didn't need to make you cry. If I'm not back again this time tomorrow, carry on, as if nothing really matters. I sometimes wish I'd never been born at all. Carry on, as if nothing really matters. So you think you can stop me and spit in my eyes? So you think you can love me and leave me to die? No, baby, can't do this, baby. Just gotta get it right out of here. Oh, baby, can't do it, baby. Just gotta get it right out of here. Oh, carry on, as if nothing really matters. I sometimes wish I'd never been born at all, yeah. 'Cause nothing really matters. Anyone can feel. Nothing really matters to me. Anyway, the wind blows. 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 Anyway, the wind blows.
So what you've just seen is a short preview of Bohemian Rhapsody. The full song runs for over 20 minutes, with the intervention and repetition of the scratch, drawing audiences into an extended sonic encounter, encouraging a certain lingering, at times demanding, jarring, unsettling, but then also mesmerizing, ritualistic, transporting, and I do believe potentially transforming. I'd like to share with you an entry from the visitors book at the ZICO South African National Gallery, in which the installation has been sounding, or had sounded, it's just come down, for over a year now. This is one of literally hundreds of reflections, but I think it really expresses something of the durée and spectrum of the scratch experience. This song is for, at first made me sick, not sick, dizzy. Fear of the sickness is worse than the thing itself. After coming and going, trying to block out the music, which took me to the experience of trauma, that which cannot be narrated. Held, withstood, I returned. I stayed until I was no longer dizzy. Writing on the complex, iterative, and affective register of the scratch, following her experience of this song's fall. Pumla Paula, whose work I've already cited, reflects, the scratch in each melody is an apt metaphor for the scratch created by rape in a survivor's life. A scratched record irreparably alters a song as rape does its afterlives, disrupting the ease of seamlessness. The scratch is permanently etched onto the psyche. Rape may not define a survivor's life. After all, the survivor continues to feel and experience a range of other life textures and emotions. Still, there is no escape. The song cycle returns to the moment of disruption in each song. Each return is recall, sometimes expected, often unannounced. Audience members or participants are thus drawn into a location of cyclic recall, as the event of rape returns as trauma and haunts a life. But it is also a location of deep entanglement, of counterclaims, as a desire to survive, to live, insistently performs a refusal of death, refusing the negation of Black femme life that is the governing logic of this normative, systemic, patriarchal violence. And here I want to think about the ways in which Tina Kampt and others are thinking about refusal, or rather practicing refusal. Kampt speaks to a refusing of the terms of diminished subjecthood, of life rendered illegible, inconsequential. This is a practice, an everyday labor, a striving, as she puts it, to create possibility in the face of negation. Next slide, please, James. Songs carry us along, can transport, uplift, and inspire. They follow an arc, a form, and resolve. They shift and shape our moods and very often transport us back or imagine us into a different time and place. Invoke a sensory world of smell, touch, feeling. This was important to how I worked with song as an alternative modality of representation and as a way of affectively broaching and to some degree making shareable experiences of trauma. The scratch is for me, however, a way of introducing a difficulty, a temporal shift, and discomfort. There is a halting impediment to the flow, a sonic glitch that frustrates the listening experience and confronts audiences with something they just can't get past. This is important to me as a means of establishing a certain set of conditions, the terms of our engagement with these dedication songs. In seeking to approach the suffering, pain, and trauma of another, we are confronted by the inherent limit of representation, as these experiences exceed our modes of articulation and our capacity to understand or fully relate. Language in all of its modalities falters, and our coming to know rests, as Judith Butler reminds us, on a certain unknowing. In the scratch, in its sounding and resounding, this representational limit, the opacity of the traumatic experience, comes to the fore, is felt and experienced, and becomes, for those willing to work with its difficulty, the opportunity for a different kind of knowing. Helpful in thinking about the possibility and imperative of this location and relation of the scratch is Sara Ahmed's conception of the contingency of pain and the impossibility of fellow feeling. In considering the problem of pain, Ahmed insists on its essentially social and interrelational character as a condition situating bodies in relation to one another and within a world of others. In this conception, pain is not limited to the interior experience of individuals, but informs and is informed by encounters with the surfaces, objects, and bodies of the environments they inhabit. The nature of such attachment, which is to say the relation of bodies in pain to other bodies in the world, is complex and demanding. The injury of pain is always such that the pain one feels is never and cannot be felt by another. If it is shared, it must be on terms other than commensurate experience. For Ahmed, this kind of relation demands the necessary acknowledgement of a certain impossibility, the impossibility of fellow feeling. Consequently, she insists that empathy is a violence in itself when understood as a claim to another's pain. This is not to suggest that suffering bodies have no bearing on others, but rather that the sociality of pain, complicated by the irreducibility of its experience, calls for an alternative ethics of empathic response. For Ahmed, this calls for a different kind of inhabitants, by which she means a form of political relationality premised not on some absolving drive for resolution or healing, but on, as she suggests, learning to live with the possibility, or at least the impossibility, of reconciliation, or learning that we live with and beside each other, and yet we are not as one. To linger in the scratch is then to inhabit a certain relation, not of commonality, or the presumed empathy of over-identification, but a contingent mutuality of political bearing and acknowledged, often incommensurable difference. This calls for something more than bearing witness, rather an implicated, embodied relation, or what Tina Camp describes as an effortful practice of hapticity. This is not an empathy or feeling for as much as it is a precarious feeling in relation to differentially valued and devalued bodies. It is, as she rather beautifully puts it, the labor of love required to feel across difference, precarity, and suffering, of creating and sustaining affiliation and intimacy by embracing the inextricability of joy and trauma. This hapticity, or different inhabitants of the scratch, is what this song is for, seeks to enable and open up. This is a relation and community premised on the uneasy terms of difference and bearing. And it is in such a relation that I recognize and hope for a certain capacity for transformation, a possibility of possibility, for the reinscription of Black femme life. And so from the scratch and with the scratch, I turn to the effusive, ephemeral working or performing of the rhapsodic. If we could play the next slide, please, James. The preview I've shared is just an excerpt of the full song as it is included in the installation. I intentionally decided to begin within the scratch as this location of relation we have been thinking from. And then the song opens up and resumes. And when it does, there is the most extraordinary sense of release, relief, and yes, a kind of rhapsodic lightness. And that is part of what I'm thinking about in relation to this idea of the rhapsodic. But this is not to suggest that what I'm thinking about is a kind of hereafter, a getting over and past, and some binary framing of trauma as event and healing as resolution. Rather, it is about the possibility of a certain rhapsodic space opening from within that glitch and difficulty of the scratch. But let me read first the words that she, who chooses to withhold her name, shared along with her song in color yellow. What shall I say? What shall I write? I have deleted my words several times, written and rewritten them, tried again and again, but I know that even if I delete them, they will be an eternal replay, an eternal retracing of feelings of what I relive day after day. The smear is there. It stares at me every day. It forces me to have to confront it straight on, from the side, from the back. There is no getting away from it. Today, I am able to own it without guilt. I was abused. I felt guilty for years and wanted to prove to the world that everything was all right. But deep inside, I was shattered. My wounds will never ever heal completely, and I grow them. I've grown roses in this garden of mine. I care with much tenderness for this little corner of myself because I know there is no cure. There are but remedies taken in small doses to alleviate the symptoms of the silent wound. Woman, water your gardens and fertilize this incurable wound with self-love. I will not write of the depths I have sunk to. I simply sing, meditate, pray. Sing, meditate, and pray for us, one day at a time. This magnificent and deeply affecting reflection allows for a certain sensing and feeling our way into this idea of the rhapsodic. In Rhapsody, we think of a certain affective register, a performed possibility of rapture, the ecstatic, of extravagant emotion. And it comes to us through music, improvisatory and irregular in form. It speaks to a certain virtuosity that plays out in this open irregularity. What happens and what becomes possible when an aria like Ave Maria or an anthemic pop single like Save the Hero is radically disrupted, shifted off course, and altered through a sustained sonic incursion. As the repeated performance of the scratch, the sonic incursion is truly virtuosic. For these collaborating musicians to perform that broken record moment, sometimes over 20 minutes, is a technical and durational feat. And so what is interesting to me is how the rhapsodic begins to sound and resound within that very difficulty of the scratch, within the altered conditions of disruption. And not only as a kind of emergence or release or even return to form, but as an opening within the difficulty, a possibility within the impossibility. What does the shared text speak to, if not the possibility of us feeling and caring and nurturing into being another space in which to be? This space, this garden, this corner of the self sits within a context of woundedness, that which cannot heal, but we must heed the words of a woman who chooses to withhold her name. Water your gardens and fertilize this incurable wound with self-love. For me, thinking the rhapsodic always in uneasy relation to the scratch, to its difficulty and disruption, is thinking about possibility within context of violent inscription, about hospitable spaces for relation and community that open within, as Catherine McKittrick suggests, the folds of power. This is about a sociality premised on difference and bearing, open to love as effortful labor, as practices of refusal, as Black virtuosity, as intimacy, care, and the everyday reinscription of Black femme life on terms other than those of negation and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. That was amazing and deserves much more than resounding silence that Zooms affords it. But I know that people will have really taken so much from that, whether they're colleagues in the university who are thinking about decolonizing the curriculum, or whether it's people who are just really thinking about how to live within a community of empathy and care. We've had the work open to our audiences from the 18th of May, and so we've lived with this incredible impact that the work has upon people. We've had people really share how much it's touched them and moved them, and created this space for them to think about so many of the issues that you've raised tonight. So thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Because we've lived with the work for a little bit, I thought I'd maybe start just by asking you a couple of questions that seem to be coming from the community around us. The first of those is that, as well as respecting individual survivors, this is also a work that's very much about something that is systemic, that's tragically global, that's institutionalized, and that was really exaggerated through the pandemic. And I guess this comes from us being part of the University of Edinburgh, but we're really aware of the need to help young adults of any gender to really understand consent. And I just wondered what role you felt that artworks like This Song Is For might play in helping people to challenge this system.
Well, you know, James, I often say that when one begins to think of, or at least try to frame and conceptualize what art can and cannot do, or should not be doing, we can find ourselves in treacherous waters. And there's no such thing as a right or wrong way. That being said, and holding to your important question, and I suppose thinking about the kind of pedagogical capacity of art, absolutely, to some degree, I think it should be able to speak into that kind of space. But if anything, it's thinking about, well, what is the kind of sort of pedagogical work that it can do? So here, I think one really has to begin to think quite carefully about, if we think that we then come to something, we're educated about it, and we leave from that encounter with a certain kind of knowing. If anything, and here I return to my talk, if anything, I think what is demanded by the inherently incommensurate experience that is the trauma, the pain, and the suffering of another, of each and every single one of us, regardless of the degree to which that occurs within our lives, it is premised on, and as all the magnificent theorists I cite, as Ahmed and Butler and Das tell us, the most ethical response to and coming to that experience is about a certain unknowing. That being said, and I think this is where it becomes so significant, where how we might come to these experiences is to think that it's within that space of unknowing, within conceding to the inability to be able to access and understand another's experience, we are bound to them. And we are compelled to, I mean, as Ahmed so beautifully speaks about the contingency of pain, we are bound to respond through and across that non-understanding, the incommensurability, but nonetheless, it's that beautiful framework of the politics of relationality that they set up for us to think about. This is how we come to these kinds of experiences, not on the basis of, well, I'm walking through Frieze, I come across a work that's dealing with ecological collapse, and tick, I've got it, I've consumed that experience, I know what's going on. No, if anything, it's about, in terms of the politics of relationality, and I think this is where, what is the kind of teaching and learning that we can gain from work is, how do I become implicated in that? So I'm not distant and I'm not removed from it, but rather I am implicated, I am imbricated. And in ways that troubles I'm not just talking about the sort of binary of victim perpetrator, but each and every single one of us, that we come to this in ways that we begin to start to understand and feel for and relate to, that includes our person within that experience. So I think that's where, therein lies the potential capacity for, I suppose, for a certain kind of art. And that being said, I speak for myself, not for others, to do that sort of work.
That's an amazing answer, Gabrielle, and I think not just because you've expressed it so eloquently, but because we've amazingly been able to see that as a reality. I mean, there's a very pragmatic sense in which the sound of your artwork follows people through this exhibition, but there's also a sense that emotionally people can't just walk away from it. They're carrying it with them throughout the rest of the show, even when they've left that space entirely. So I think that's wonderful to think about, that kind of openness that art can provide us with. Just to sort of riff off the idea of openness, before I ask my next question, I'm just going to encourage folk who are also with us to maybe start to drop a few questions into the chat box if you've got them. I'm sure you're already sort of delighted that we've got Gabrielle with us here tonight, so please do take the opportunity to ask questions if you've got them, and I'll pick them up in just a moment. Another thing I'm conscious of, Gabrielle, is that we're surrounded by a community of students who are studying art, and we're here to support emerging artists as well. And so I do ask this question often, but I think it's a really important one. But what advice could you give, and what experience might you share to those who are approaching difficult subjects within their artwork, which might include other people's pain, as you've described it tonight?
And here I circle slightly, partially back to what I'd said earlier on, and I'm always so mindful of this. I totally see where the question comes from, but I think of myself within that position of a teacher within the context of the university, and speaking to this large, diverse, magnificent group of individuals, all making work in highly singular ways, and saying that art is that thing that remains unbounded, and no one should dictate to you what you do with it. That being said, I absolutely hold to within, I suppose, my own practice and my own very personal experiences. And here I think too, and I'll give you a very truncated version of it, but as a very young artist seeking to make a work that was commemorative and specifically directed towards a school friend that I had lost to a domestic incident, and then encountering the figure of my mother saying to me, you can't just broach this topic as though it were this distant other suffering with this massive remove between yourself and those individuals, but rather you know them, they're known by name, and you should speak to them. And so it's not about then, in that instance, approaching violence in generality. So for me, the lesson there, and that is what happened. It was the whole sense of then having to engage with and interact quite personally and quite directly the very individuals implicated within the scenario of loss, and speak to them and ask them and come to them with this proposition of wanting to make this work that was meant to be commemorative, and ask how they felt about that. And so that's when I speak about this messy business of being implicated. It's one thing if you are, and I always cite this, and I'm not afraid to, but it's one thing if you are in keeping with the Alfredo Jarre complex, you just tick off these boxes very easily. Oh, well, I've dealt with that socio-political ill. Oh, next one, so. And it's very broad and meta. But as soon as you start to engage with individuals, it becomes a different, messy, implicated kind of work. And so for me, and this is something I hold to within my own practice, but I do, when others come to me, say, well, what does it mean for you to think quite carefully about what you're putting out there in the world in ecological terms, in spiritual terms, in affective terms, in conceptual terms, in relational terms. And as the one who is doing so, to be able to be held to account for what you're putting out there. And for me, that very importantly breaks away from the we have to speak about it, the paradigm of the great male white genius artist who gets to make and do and comment and do whatever they like in ways that they're not held to account. That concept of the genius artist, but to do so in a way where you are implicated, situated in a world of others, and where your actions may have a bearing upon others. And so this is where I do especially encourage those who do come to these thematics that have and are so deeply entangled with these very fraught, knotty issues, to think about what is demanded of me to retain a kind of ethics of representation, a kind of ethical way of making and being in the world. And in order to do so is to hold at the forefront of your mind the subject and the thematics of your work, and allow that to lead and to direct and to shape the ways in which you make work.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So I can see that Tessa has a hand raised, so I might invite Tessa to come forward to ask the next question while I pick up on a few other questions from our audience. I'll just very quickly say, if you don't want to turn your camera on and speak in front of everyone, or even if you don't want to type into the public chat, you can also private message me if you want me to ask Gabrielle something on your behalf. Tessa?
Thanks, James. Wonderful, Gabrielle. Thank you so much. Speaking of the implicated, though, I would love to hear you talk a bit about the performers, because you've spoken with us about this before, but you know, in terms of the production of the artwork, that idea that they are performing that scratch for sometimes 15 minutes in some of the art, it's extraordinary, and the mental space that they must be in. I'd love it if you would share what that was like.
Well, absolutely, Tessa. Such a wonderful prompt. And thinking about how so many people come to the work not realizing that is physically performed, that moment of glitch and repetition, it's not mechanically reproduced. The significance there is, and here I to some degree move back to the ways in which I work, and thinking about how do I approach these very difficult subjects in ways that I hope to not, and to as less a degree as I can, not re-perpetuate, re-trigger, re-instigate image, sound, and so forth, violence and trauma. Nonetheless, without skirting, eliding, or blind spotting the difficulty and the violence of that experience. And that comes through by way of that repetitive glitch within the song is for. The significance there, of course, and this comes by way of, as I've said to Tessa and James, it's such a gargantuan project and so highly relational. In speaking to and approaching these individuals who re-perform these songs, coming to them not just with what happens to be a sort of aesthetic brief, but rather one so deeply implicated in the lives of others, as in you, Nonku Peri, are now charged with re-performing and reimagining songs selected by not anonymous faceless individuals, but named specific individuals with specific experiences. To come to that and to think, well, what does it mean to now invest with and put in that labor of performing what is ultimately me deploying the device of music to some degree, and what is made possible within that space, reenact and reperform what is that cycle of trauma experienced by these individuals. So there's that apparatic nature of trauma, is the incommensurate experience of trauma. But how do we come to it? How do we begin to create this encounter where some can come to another's experience? And that's what becomes so key, the ways in which these extraordinary musicians, and as I speak of Black, femme, queer virtuosity, they come to it and they are virtuosic in their performance and in the labors that they invest in making possible these performances, which for us, they do so on behalf of us as those coming to it. They invoke what is ultimately traumatic recall, but by way of such different means. So significant. And of course, I mean, Tessa may be also touching on some of the background stories I gave them, where this was no mean feat. It was so challenging and taxing, and every single person involved, from the many lighting technicians to my videographer to the performers, who were having to enact what was undoubtedly arduous labor. It was not simple. So yes, absolutely.
So Gabrielle, I've just had a question sent to me, and this might be riffing a little bit off the idea of openness, but someone saying that they know it's an ongoing work. And I mean, do you envision some kind of conclusion of the work at some point in the future, or will it go on forever?
Well, it depends which work they're talking about. So if I think about, and it's a wonderful question, because there's so many things to consider. So I often would speak of elegy, the work I opened my talk with, as a work without ending, and that it would only come to an end when that nature of violence came to an end. That being said, and I don't do this to try and make light of the individuals who have been subjected to this nature of violence, and to try and equate myself and the performer's experience to that. That being said, to undertake the work of elegy is unimaginably taxing and requires, I opened this talk of mine speaking to the curatorial care that yourself and Tessa and Colm have demonstrated towards the Song is For. It requires immeasurable amounts of curatorial care. And when that is not in place, it's not possible to hold the work. So that is a work that is to some degree drawing to some kind of end, but I mean, those ends, it depends on what we mean by that. This Song is For is a work that, to some degree, yes, I spoke of it too as ongoing, and so many of my works are long-term, durational, and ongoing. That being said, there is also something about, and this is where I'm very careful to attend to it, the relation between the singular and the collective. So thinking very carefully around the highly singular, incommensurate experience of an individual in relation always to the communal and the collective experience. And I think to some degree that this Song is For, as it stands and as it holds these particular 11 individuals' songs, is to some degree complete. So that's what I would say for that work.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We've got a question now from Petra, and Petra, I might ask, would you be prepared to unmute yourself and turn your camera on and ask Gabrielle the question directly?
Oh, hello. I'm not sure if you can hear me because I'm sitting in a place which is really noisy. So can you hear me? Is it right?
We can hear you.
Perfect. So I was just wondering, I feel this, well, first of all, thank you so much for such a profound and so provoking talk, because that was amazing. And my question is that I feel that I think you mentioned it in a part, but what made you in the first place consider this entanglement you made between musical structures and trauma, because I feel it's so strong, and I know you have already commented upon that, but maybe what made you in the first place start thinking about this connection? So this was it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Petra. What a wonderful question and set of prompts. So yes, absolutely, as you say, I partially responded to it, but I think what's so important about what you're asking goes back to the heart of how I make and why I make. And that comes to attending to a very long, violent history of representation. So thinking about how certain bodies, certain subject positions have been subjected to a kind of symbolic representational violence. And here, of course, I attend to all those social catastrophes that I mentioned. So we think of the imperial age, we think of enslavement, we think of apartheid, but how if this is the case, that these histories have subjected certain bodies to a violence, how do I, in attending to contemporary experiences of violence that are very much deeply entangled with these histories, they haven't just popped out as this strange phenomenon, but there's this historical legacy. How do I approach these experiences without running that risk of re-perpetuating and recycling suffering, pain, and trauma, but rather look to do so in ways that is not about re-representing that violence? So when one comes to the work, and I'm going to say something else to qualify this, but when one comes to the work, you don't come to these figurative representations of bodies in pain and suffering. Rather, you come to music, you come to sound, you come to light, you come to text, you come to color. So I looked at these alternative means of approaching these, what are undoubtedly difficult experiences. That being said, and here I think very carefully about in being mindful of, regardless of what you do within art, regardless of what you do within the realm of representation, as an artist, and this is something I hold to, you always run the risk of doing a measure of violence. You don't know how others come to your work. You don't know what their prior life experiences are. So they may come to this work and you may think that you've put all these things in place and it's not going to do violence to them. That being said, it may still. So those are the kinds of things I hold in tension in terms of what I actually do. Mindful of the fact that one always runs the risk of doing a degree of violence. And by violence, I mean, of course, not just physical, but structural, linguistic, sonic, and so forth. That being said, I always strive towards doing a lesser kind of violence, and especially mindful always of the work and what it is doing. And a big important thing for me, and the curators would know this because I spoke so much about it, but talking about how my work is not about violence. My work is about, it happens within the wake of violence. It happens within that space after, and it looks to do a different kind of work. And the work for me, so importantly, when I think of this song as Fall, is so importantly about us, whether we've had that kind of experience or not. Others coming to these experiences and being affected in a way that they then begin to realize how another's experience of pain calls to them and asks for them to respond in some kind of way. So those are really important core considerations for me in making and art making and aesthesis.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gabrielle, and thanks, Petra, for asking the question. I'm going to invite Steph up now. If you're happy, Steph, to turn your camera on and unmute yourself to ask your question to Gabrielle directly. Is Steph with us? Okay, let me read out Steph's question. Sorry, it's moving around quickly in here. So Steph is asking if you could expand your thinking around the body within the context of your work and the involvement of other bodies, and the bodies of the performers and the bodies of visitors spatially when experiencing the work encountered in the installation.
Okay, that's a wonderful question. I think it's an especially significant question, well, for both works in actual fact, both Elegy and This Song is For. I'll start with Elegy perhaps as an entry point into what Steph is asking. And thinking about how Elegy is a work, for example, that is entirely premised on absence, the absent presence of the individual being commemorated and to whom the work is being directed. And in order to address that absence, and in order to work towards invoking that absence, the presence of the performance becomes so significant as these surrogate presences that will physically, literally sound forth, body forth this very absent presence. They make possible the lament, the sonic environment that we inhabit in a work such as Elegy, where sound builds within the space, and it's within that, as tenuous as that is, we come to the absent presence of the individual being commemorated. The significance of the bodies of the participants coming to that work, the significance of the performers making possible that experience is what I hold to, and that's the politics of collective mourning. In order to make that possible, in order to bring that about, once again, I mean, thinking of what Petrus just asked and what we were just talking about, but thinking about how this is not only or solely to do with those subjected to such violence, but all of us, each and every single one of us, are called to come to that experience. And I would say that it's not dissimilar with This Song is For, and that This Song is For does not purport to be speaking on behalf of these survivors, nor, and this is bearing in mind, as I said, the sort of incommensurate experience of trauma and pain, nor being able to relay that experience to others. Nonetheless, and that being said, it does strive to, and I said, you know, as I said, it's tenuous and it's fragile. It does nonetheless strive towards creating a different kind of encounter. So not an encounter as we come to it with the spectacle of violence as perpetrated against Black, brown, femme, queer bodies, but rather the suffering of another, but in a way that does have a bearing upon us. And so presence, you know, Steph, what a beautiful question. Presence is key. It is so key because it's presence that makes possible, and here I turn back to my earlier responses, this politics of relationality that we all, each and every single one of us, have this connection to one another, premised entirely on this non-understanding, turning back to what James was asking me earlier on. It is a non-understanding, but nonetheless, it doesn't let us off the hook. It doesn't let us off the hook to the degree where you can say, oh, well, no, it still calls us to be present and presence ourselves within that space. And so that's where, for me, the bodies, the subject positions, the presence of the performers, of participants, not passive, active participants that come to the work That's so key and significant in making possible what the work is calling for.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I think Zoom's playing a lot of tricks on us tonight, so it prevented Steph from being present there because her sound's not working. But thank you so much for answering that question. I wonder, Gabrielle, if I should ask you just one more question that's been sent to me, and then we'll round things up. But someone is interested to know what practices of self-care you use, given that your work brings you so close to trauma.
Yeah. So I'm very self-reflexive when I respond to this question, because I'm so mindful of thinking of how my work is instigated by a very personal compulsion to respond affectively, aesthetically to particular scenarios that so often impede our ability to respond. And this is so often when I say language falters and fails. So in keeping with that idea, and in thinking of what I believe to be the transformative capacity of art, however fleeting, and however to some degree, I mean, one has to be mindful of the structures in which we engage with art. It's limited, it's elite, it's always about the politics of access and so forth. Nonetheless, to think about how art offers us that capacity to come to and to broach what is so difficult, and where other disciplines and forms of therapy and healing might fail, art opens up a different kind of space. And so for me, and in part in keeping with the question that was asked, art is to some degree a means of self-care, a means of finding a way of grappling with and working through and stumbling along. As someone who, yes, can be frayed at the edges, unbounded and fallible. But nonetheless, it's about, for me, feeling blessed as one who is an artist and who has art at my disposal. And then, of course, attending to care and this notion of self-care, bracketing the self, as one entirely contingent on a world of others, and one as situated in a world of others. And that so regularly we perhaps become fixated on the self without realizing that in order for us to get by is so reliant on others and the world of others, and that world in which we're implicated, and how we relate to others. And so for me, self-care is so very entangled with that. It's not only, and I can, of course, I can speak to you about certain practices that I put in place, like meditation and so forth. But if anything, I think if I speak of it in a very real way, it's also about really attending to, well, what do we mean when we speak about self-care? Well, self-care is about being in communion with others, and how we do so, and how we treat others, and how we attend to others within those relations. And that then begins to shape how we then think of the self and care for oneself.